Welcome to our presentation on reimagining and renewing our learning communities with habits of mind. My name is Art Costa, and I'm looking forward to working with you over the next hour, along with my colleague, Bena.
Hello, I'm Bena, and I am also looking forward to it. Art Costa and I have been working for many years together, and over the years, we've learned many things in the field, working with administrators, working with teachers, working with state departments, working internationally. And all the work that we've been doing has really been recorded pretty much in our website, in books that we've written, and in ways that we've shared with people, keynotes and presentations. And this is another one. So we're so pleased that you're able to join us. One of the things that we can say that we've learned over all this time is no matter where you are, don't get too comfortable, because what happens is things are changing so rapidly. Over the years that we've been working, it is amazing how many new things have been going on. Certainly with the speed of things that are brought to us through technology, it is absolutely amazing how rapidly things are changing, how many, many more complex problems seem to be bringing us into the world together, and how we are really becoming more uncertain with this complexity, and certainly more ambiguous about what the good solutions are. And so it's work now. And what we're suggesting is that as we're doing this work, as we're becoming really better as skillful learners and problem solvers, we're also trying to become more skillful as leaders in a learning organization. Now, when we say learning organization, what we mean is that you are continuously learning, that everyone in your organization is actually leading, as long as they're behaving and taking on the actions of leadership. So what we're trying to come across with in our book, which you will have as a part of your materials in this session, and you'll be able to refer to it as we refer to it throughout what we do. And what we mean by that is that it's not just positional, it's an activity. So you may be the administrator of a school building. At the same time, you may have many, many teachers who are taking on leadership. They don't have that title, but they behave as leaders. And so we're suggesting when you're leading a learning organization, you want to invite and include as many possible people to share the behaviors of effective leadership, which all begins with the habits of mind.
So what are these habits of mind? Perhaps you are acquainted with them already. For those of you who are not acquainted with the habits of mind, let's do just a quick review. Habits of mind are the dispositions of successful people in many walks of life. They are good problem solvers. And so in order to have the success, you have to have certain dispositions, essential dispositions. For example, you have to be able to stick to a task over time or to persist. You have to be a very good listener. You have to be able to work as a team, collaboratively and cooperatively. We call it thinking interdependently. You have to be able to strive for accuracy and make sure that you have the facts and you're searching for the truth. We have to be able to remain open to continuous learning so that your lifetime is a life of continuous learning. There are 16 habits of mind. We're not going to deal with all of them in this program, but we will be taking 2 of them and showing you how that works. Habits of mind are a set of dispositions that help you become a good problem solver and how to respond empathically and intelligently when you're confronted with problems, the answers to which are not immediately apparent.
Now, what we're hopeful about is that you will be wanting to behave intelligently and empathically. And one of the ways that we're going to put some emphasis on that is we're going to start with 2 essential habits. One is listening with understanding and empathy. And then we're going to move on and talk with you about questioning and posing problems. And it's our intention to give you some tips, strategies, skills that will help you to become even better at being able to use these as you become more inclusive in your learning culture. Getting into the habit, really means that you're practicing it, that you're actually, when you develop a habit, you develop a habit because you develop it over time. You practice it, you get better at it, you work at it. And so what we're suggesting here is we're hoping that you're going to be getting into the habit of listening skillfully and empathically. In order to do that, we're going to talk with you about what it actually means to be listening empathically and with understanding.
And in order to do so, we draw on the work of Professor Carl Rogers, who is probably the father of our listening skills. And he said, the way of being with another person, which is termed empathic, means temporarily living in their life, moving about in it delicately, without making judgments. To be with another in this way means that for the time being, you lay aside the views and values you hold for yourself in order to enter the other's world without prejudice, a complex, demanding, strong yet subtle and gentle way of being. You might think for yourself about how you listen to other people. Are you able to lay aside your own views and values in order to look at the world from their point of view, to walk in their shoes, so to speak, and look through their eyes? These are the skills of good listeners, and they are one of the main skills of effective, successful leaders. In order to think about good listening, we use 3 big P's, and they are these: pausing, paraphrasing, and probing, which means to inquire more deeply and to clarify if you don't understand. So what we're going to do is to take each one of these and practice pausing, paraphrasing, and probing. And as Bena said, our intent is to get into the habit of listening even more respectfully and skillfully.
When you're pausing, you're allowing for wait time. Now, I know some people feel very impatient. In fact, one of the habits of mind that many people find is important for using wait time is managing impulsivity. You may have the impulse when somebody is answering you to just jump right in, to say something in relationship to it, to perhaps even interrupt them. And what you want to do is you want to be able to use wait time to respond by managing your impulsivity and saying, I'm just going to really listen carefully, and I'm going to allow the other person to just have enough space and time to become more complex in their thinking, to begin to think about what might happen here that's different. In other words, we might say not so much wait time as think time. And so we want to allow for people to do that. There was research that was done by Mary Budd Rowe in which she showed that after asking a question to students in classrooms, her research showed that the average teacher waits about 1 second before calling on another student. So that's really interesting, because what they do is they tend to do one of 3 things, actually. One thing that they might do is they might ask a question and then answer the question themselves because they've waited a second, 2 seconds. It seems like an eternity sometimes. You hear silence in the room and you just feel, is anybody out there? So you jump in and you answer. You ask another question sometimes because you're impatient. In fact, we're finding that so many people who are working remotely and are using Zoom, for example, or some other virtual means to have a group conversation, we're finding that it's really hard to use wait time because everybody is concerned when there's silence that nobody will come in and save the silence by continuing the conversation. So we're saying pause, learn how to pause, learn how to use wait time.
Another is paraphrasing. Paraphrasing means that you summarize or say in your own words what you hear the other person saying. It lets others know that you're listening to them and that you understand, or that you're trying to understand, and mainly that you care about them. You want to understand them. You want to be on their side and look through their eyes. So paraphrasing is the second skill that is very important after pausing or wait time.
And Art, I see so many people who went to Communication 101 And they think that they're paraphrasing when they say, I hear what you're saying, which is not what we mean by paraphrasing. So I think people have to realize that paraphrasing means you can say it in your own words. You're not repeating what the other person said. You're actually adding, perhaps not adding your own thoughts, but helping them to get more clear about how they're thinking and what you understand about how they're thinking.
Yes. And remember that when you start using the words, what I hear you saying, it shifts the focus away from your partner to you, the speaker. What you want to do is to maintain the focus on your partner.
Another thing that we have to be paying attention to is probing. Probing is inquiring or clarifying.
Yes, sometimes your partner may use some terminology or some words that you don't entirely understand. And so it's important then that you say, well, wait a minute, let me see if I understand you. You probe for clarification. It means that you inquire into what they are saying. For example, if somebody used a term that you didn't understand, you say, excuse me, but explain to me what you mean by. Or when you say terminology, what kind of terminology specifically? And so people tend to speak in generalizations, like everybody or nobody or somebody. And you might say, well, when you say everybody, you mean everybody? Everybody in the whole world? And so you probe for that clarity to make sure that you understand the other person. And what this does is to say, I'm trying to understand you, your ideas are valuable, and I want to understand them with clarity.
Now, here's an example of someone who really needs to get some clarity. When you think about listening that carefully, many people tell us that as they think about that, as they begin to become more metacognitive, they begin to realize that they're managing their listening skills. So here are some strategies that people use to make sure that they're really paying attention. For example, I know many people, Art, who say, I visualize what the other person is saying. I keep a picture in my head of what they're saying. There's many people who find that making a note or jotting down some key words work. They observe body language as the person is talking. They might observe the inflection of the voice, the particular emphasis of ideas. They observe where the person seems to be particularly emotional. In other words, all of these are cues to tell you, is the person really listening? Is the person really with you? And are you able to respond to that in kind? In other words, leaning forward if they're leaning forward, come back if they're coming back, watch their body language, watch what they're doing. And that means that we can do this whether we're in a virtual situation, such as we are right now, where we're picking up cues just the same. It was really interesting. The other day, I was in one of these Zoom meetings where we had all the pictures of everybody and we were talking. And I noticed that somebody was trying to write down everything that we were saying. And I simply said, and I knew what her name was. And I said, Priscilla, are you trying to capture everything? Which is fine, but we will be providing the PDF of this PowerPoint. So you'll be able to see all this afterwards. And she looked up so surprised and said, thank you for noticing. Thank you for being so attentive, because this is something that I really would prefer to just keep listening to you and watching your slides. So notice, it doesn't take a lot to be observant if you care about how the other person is being affected by and how you're listening. So think about this for yourselves. What values are you expressing when you listen to one another so intently? Just talk to yourself. If you're with other people, turn and talk to them. And what values are you expressing when you listen to one another so intently? We'll just take a moment. Art, as I imagine they're saying this inside their heads, what values do you find you're expressing when you listen to someone else so intently?
Well, it means that I care about them. It means that I value what they're saying. It's honoring what their ideas are. It's saying, hey, your ideas are important. It's so important that I want to understand them. I want to really listen to them. I want to capture them. And so it it's saying to the other person, you're important to me. You are a valued person for me. And all of these are skills and mental processes that I have to get into the habit. As you said earlier, I have to get in the habit of practicing. I need to attend to them. I need to make sure that I understand these skills and that I practice them and I use them and that I monitor how well I am doing.
Well, what you're saying is so true. And I would say that when I see, and what I really value is that someone isn't multitasking while I'm talking with them. There's nothing that I find more disturbing than when I'm really trying to think and communicate and say something important, and people are kind of glancing at their cell phones or turning and just trying to catch up on something. And they think that that's okay because they sometimes look up and say, hey, I'm listening to you, I really am. But it doesn't feel the same. So the value of taking the 5-10 minutes to really pay attention if you're in a conversation matters to people quite a bit. So as we think about that, I think we're also talking about the idea of questioning and posing problems. Another one where I think the idea of questioning just becomes so important. As you are valuing someone else, you're really curious about what they have to say. You really do want to hear them. So the other side of listening well is asking the kinds of questions that invite the kind of thinking and kind of understandings that you want to hear.
Well, it's not only just asking the question, but it's having a questioning, inquiring attitude. It's knowing how to ask a question to gather the kind of data that you need because you're interested in other people. It means that you are alert to problems that need solving, and sometimes that you even raise problems because it's kind of fun to solve problems. And so having a questioning attitude means that you're curious. It means that you are interested in finding out more. It means that you are wondering. There are some criteria for what makes questions powerful, and we'd like to share those with you. First of all, that your questions are invitational. And what we mean by that they include plurals, tentative language, invitational stems, positive presuppositions, and as you ask questions at complex levels of thinking. Let's take a look at each one of those and apply them to some questions that you might ask.
So think about a question you were asked or that maybe you asked in the past few days, and just jot it down. If you have a pencil and paper or pen and paper handy, perhaps you want to pull up another tab if you're on your computer. But think about where you might just record this. You're not going to have to share it, but what we're asking you is to take that question that you asked perhaps and just put it down. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have you remodel that question as we present to you the criteria that Art just mentioned. So just take a moment to write down a question that either you were asked or you would like to ask. Perhaps you're imagining a question that you ask a parent, a question you ask a teacher, a question you ask a student. But in your documentation there, you need to put it down so you can keep changing it.
So let's take a look at the first of these criteria for powerful questions. And the first one that we're going to talk about is plurals. Now let me explain what we mean by that. When you ask a question like, do you have an idea? Notice that the answer to that could be yes or no. Or we could say, do you have a goal? Yes. That's not very exciting. However, when we ask a question that has plurals, like what ideas, notice that's plural, what ideas do you have? It causes your brain to think of more than one. If you ask for just one idea, I can stop after the first. But if I ask for ideas, you have to think of more. What are some of the goals you have for this lesson? Notice that that's asking you to think of many. What outcomes do you seek? What alternatives are you considering? Would you take a moment now with the question that you jotted down or that you're holding in your head and see if you can make it into plurals? Could you add some words that would make it plural rather than just singular? Go back to your question and edit it.
So another one is tentativeness. And this is really interesting in some of the research that Dan Siegel did on the brain research. What he discovered was that when you use tentative language, your brain starts to sort of search a landscape. So for example, if I ask you something like, what did you have for dinner last night? You start to think about that and you know, here's what I had, and you sort of make your list. But if I say to you, what might be a good idea for tomorrow night's dinner? Now I'm asking you to search the landscape of many different things that may have had. Maybe you had a great meal 2 weeks ago that you wanted to come back with. Maybe you have an association to a meal that you had and people that you shared it with. So when you ask the question in a tentative way, what you're asking is, what might be some of the places that you have? What might be some factors that would cause? You're saying, I'm not sure about this. If in fact you are sure about this, then don't be manipulative. You don't ask the question with tentativeness unless you're truly inviting somebody to be curious with you. What other ways could you solve this problem? That suggests that even if I know that Art is trying to solve the problem in this way, I don't know what other ways he could solve the problem. It's in his head, and he has to then share it. When I say, what hunches do you have that may explain this situation? It means we're going to make inferences. We're going to think in tentative ways. It's not what were the 3 things that explain this situation. It's really allowing yourself to stay in that tentative world, that slightly ambiguous world, in which your mind then generates even more ideas. So now look at the question that you wrote down and see whether you can, in addition to adding plurals, can you use some of the tentative language? What might, what could, what maybe, what hunches?
And yet another criteria for powerful questions is the use of invitational stems. What's very interesting about this is that you can actually engage the thinking process in another person's mind by including an invitational stem to your question. For example, as you recall what we have been talking about so far, and notice what goes on in your head, you actually go back and recall what we've been talking about so far. As you anticipate using some of these ideas in your own interaction, and what that invites you to do is to think ahead to how you might use some of these ideas. As you envision your organization in which people are using these ideas, and given what you know about kindergarten children, for example, given what you know about this technology, given what you know about parent involvement, all of those are ways of engaging another person's thought processes. Very, very powerful that you have the power as a questioner to engage another person's thought process simply by asking an invitational stem, by asking a question that begins with an invitational stem. So as you anticipate using invitational stems in your questioning, what might they sound like?
Good question, Art. Very good.
Would you take a moment now and add an invitational stem to the question that you are editing?
In presuppositions, there's always a hidden meaning below the surface of the language. And so you need to be looking for that. For example, if we said, even Henry could complete that project, what would you think, Art?
Well, I would think that Henry is not too bright, or that project is pretty simple. I didn't say that, but what you said, even Henry could complete that project, makes me think that.
So in a way, you're making an inference because you're assuming that the project wasn't complex and that Henry wasn't perhaps the brightest kid in the class. That's what you're saying?
Exactly.
So you're really making inferences from the hidden meaning below the surface of the language. So we see this all the time. It's the way you say it, it's the inflection you have. You don't have to say it to see what its meaning might be. And there are very limiting presuppositions. So if I say to you, do you have an objective? What would you say?
Well, do you think I wouldn't have an objective? My
Oh,
goodness.
all right. Well, why were you unsuccessful?
Well, I could think of all kinds of reasons. Which one do you want?
Oh, okay. Well, if you had only listened.
Well, how do you know I didn't?
So notice that the limiting presupposition put Art immediately on the defensive. It's almost an interrogation. Do you have an objective today? It's kind of like, I'm assuming you may not have it. And so I'm just saying, do you have one? Why were you unsuccessful? Who says he's unsuccessful? So you notice that the limiting presupposition puts him in a defensive mode. And the way that I phrased it makes him feel like I'm actually interrogating him. Whereas if I were to say, I think we can turn these around. If I were to say, Art, tell me some of the objectives you have for today's session. Now, right away, what am I saying? I'm saying some objectives you might have. How do you feel about that one?
Well, I feel more powerful. I feel more competent because you know that I have objectives.
And instead of saying, if you had only listened, suppose I were to say to you, as I observed you, I thought that perhaps you were not listening. Would that work?
Well, maybe it was, and maybe I wasn't.
So I'm not going to put a negative in there at all this time. And I'm going to say, tell me a little bit about what you heard when I was talking, Art. Tell me some of the things that you remember.
Well, I remembered what you said about good language and about good questioning.
So right away, what I'm doing is I'm sort of modeling and playing with you on the idea that this is really very important, because so often I think we trap people in a negative assumption rather than making it positive and assuming that they have better intentions. What we've learned over the years about this is that when you assume a positive presupposition, what happens is that people often step up to the plate and they actually then behave in more positive ways. So for example, did you forget to do your assignment again? Why don't you like to sketch? If you look at these, and then you look at these, you can see the transformation.
Take a moment and examine both sides of this slide. Take a look at the column on the left. What examples do they have in common? What are some commonalities among all of them? Take a look at the examples on the right. What commonalities do they have? Maybe you are noticing that all of the examples on the left are negative. They assume failure. They put another person down. They make them feel like they're inadequate. On the other hand, in the column on the right, these are positive assumptions. They make them feel confident. They make them feel like they've accomplished something. They make them feel worthy. They make them feel like they can do. They make them feel like they are efficient and competent. What we want is to accentuate positive presuppositions and eliminate the negative presuppositions. Let's take a look even more deeply. Here are some empowering presuppositions. Notice, what are some of the goals you have in mind for this class, for this meeting? Now notice that we're saying plurals, first of all, some, and goals that are plural, but not only that, you have a mind. You have planned for this meeting. You are mindful of this meeting. So it is an assumption that you are a planned, thoughtful, prepared person who is going to lead this meeting. Notice how empowering that is. Here's another one. As you consider your alternatives, which seem most promising? Now notice what we're assuming is that you are a considerate person. You are thoughtful. You have alternatives. And of all of those alternatives, you've evaluated them so that you know and you have some ideas about which of them are most promising. You
But
are prepared, you are flexible, and you are considerate.
let me just interact with you around that for a moment also, Art, because what I've seen is that when you use language like this, even if you hadn't considered any alternatives, it triggers your mind to do so. So you might say, as you consider your alternatives, you might say, well, I actually haven't considered any alternatives, but now that you say that, here's one that I think might work. So that it doesn't necessarily say that you're always having, your mind isn't always prepared when you're given an empowering presupposition. Sometimes you're triggering the reaction and the response that helps them to be prepared.
Yes, it opens your mind to consider that there are alternatives, certainly. Here's another one.
What personal learnings or insights will you carry forward? I think that's such a powerful one, because I think when you're asked to, after you've been to a session, such as the session today, we might ask you, what personal learnings or insights will you carry forward to future situations? What a powerful question. Now let's just look at that as a very empowering presupposition, because we could ask this, we could say, reflect on what you've learned today. That would work, and it's a lovely thing, and many of us do this often. But notice what difference this is. Let's look at this and just say, when we're asking you about your personal learnings, we're asking you about your insights. So now I'm not just asking you to reflect, I'm asking you to do a little sense making. I'm asking you to say how you will really, what kinds of things you really have as an insight. Now, the reason I want to know about your insights is because I'm hoping you will carry this forward to another situation. So what I'm asking you in this question is not only what you've learned and your insights, but I'm asking you to be sure to take action and use these in another situation in the future. All of that is in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 words. What an empowering opportunity to think about how I can bring you into the culture, how I can make you feel leadership in the culture, how I can include you. And at the same time, I've only asked you a very empowering presuppositional question. It's very, very powerful for people.
Let's take just a moment before we go on and go back to your question that you are editing and see if you can add an empowering, positive presupposition. The next and last component of powerful questions is to choose the level of thinking at which you wish your partner or the other person to think. And hopefully that thinking is complex kind of thinking, not simple kind of thinking. And so we have a little poem here by none other than Oliver Wendell Holmes, who helps us remember a three-story intellect. Holmes said, there are one-story, two-story, and three-story intellects with skylights. All fact collectors who have no aim beyond their facts are one-story men. Now, Oliver was a little gender sexist, so I will have to say one-story people. Two-story people compare, reason, generalize using the labors of the fact collectors as well as their own. Three-story people idealize, they imagine, they predict. Their best illumination comes from above, through the skylight. And so my question to you is, what level of thinking do you want your partner to engage in? Whatever that is, you will ask a question at the appropriate level, first story, second story, or third story. So let's take a look then at these three stories of the intellect. The first one is just simply input, gathering information. Such things as identifying and listing and matching and naming and observing and reciting and defining. And those are all very important questions, but they're all very low level, asking you to just simply produce the facts, or go back into memory and recite a list or create share an observation.
But notice that they really are quite foundational, just as they are the foundation of the house. In other words, sometimes people say, oh, I really go right up to the higher level questions. But without definition about what you're talking about, you can be exchanging opinions, but you may not be talking about the same thing. So it really says that people who understand this say, I do need to really make sure that I'm building a foundation for innovation, intervention, imagination. But I build it by using the kinds of words, as you often do with me, Art, when you say, well, when you say thing, what do you mean exactly when you're saying that? You're asking me to define and to describe. So that becomes foundational.
The second story is doing something with that input. In other words, you process it somehow. You make sense out of it. So it is performing such thinking skills as comparing and contrasting, classifying, explaining, inferring, synthesizing, reasoning. In other words, it's making sense out of the input that you have gathered. It is doing something that is causing a relationship, making some kind of a synthesis.
And when you're doing that, what's really interesting is that we said that this habit is questioning and posing problems. And this is where you're beginning to find and begin to think about the posing of problems. As you're making sense and as you're processing this, you begin to ask the question, and then you might begin to speculate. You might begin to imagine. You might begin to hypothesize.
Notice that all of these at the third story are going beyond. That is thinking of something new, thinking of something creative, generating, hypothesizing, theorizing, predicting, something that takes you beyond just the processing and helps you to apply it beyond the situation in which it was learned. So it goes above, beyond the skylight. So let's take a look now at the three-story intellect, all in one house. Here you are on the right-hand side, all of those thinking skills organized into three stories: input, processing, and output. So the question we have for you is, what level of thinking do you want your partner or your student or the other person to think? Do you want them to think at the output level, to evaluate and generalize and create? Do you want them to process information by comparing and contrasting? Or do you want them simply to recall by counting and identifying and defining? That's up to you. However, we know that when you are working at the third level, you're also working at the second and first level. And so what makes it complex is that all three levels are engaged when you ask the higher level kinds of questions. So at this time, we would invite you to go back to your question and add a complex level of thinking. What level of thinking do you want the other person to engage in? And would you please edit your question once again to include one of these three levels?
And we know that you've been doing a lot of work around your questions and that you're really thinking about them. And hopefully you've seen some transformation of your question, and perhaps you've found ways to make it more powerful and to really think about the idea. And we certainly understand when you develop questions, you wouldn't use all of these all at once necessarily. What you would do is you would find when appropriately to start looking at, when should I use an invitational stem? I see people getting so in the habit of doing that they just tend to do it very automatically. As you're considering this, as I invite you into this conversation, it's kind of inviting in. Many people are using that. That's one of the easier ones to sort of add into your repertoire. Using plurals and really thinking about the idea of using more than one so that you're inviting people to think in larger, bigger ways. Using tentative language so that you really are saying what might be, what could be, possibly. Using positive presuppositions to make sure that you are really saying that we are thinking positively about this and that we're assuming the very best of you, and that we're working to make sure that we don't leave you, when we question with you, we don't leave you feeling defensive. And then finally, we talk about the complex levels of thinking. All of these are important criteria to use. And so what we're finding is that not only are they important to use in conversations, but people use them for surveys, for trying to understand, use questioning to try to understand how people are feeling about something. They use them to try to understand qualitative information about how things are working for them. What kinds of ideas are you coming up with? How might this problem be solved differently? You'll notice that in surveys and in focus groups and in questions where you're trying to get more information, very powerful to use these questioning skills.
And when we say keep them in mind, we mean exactly that. Because to change a habit, you have to be mindful about it. You have to pay attention to it. And that doesn't happen in one example. You have to practice and try and try and try again. You have to persist in forming a habit by keeping these in mind. You might just take one of them at a time, like invitational stems, and practice that for a while. And so we know that the more that you practice and the more mindful you are about your questions, the more you get in the habit of asking powerful invitational questions.
So now that we've gone through all of this, we've gone through the listening, we've gone through the questioning, let's see whether we can pull it all together for you. So Art and I are going to model what it's like to actually use powerful listening and questioning.
So Bena, tell me what you're working on.
Well, I've been doing a lot of work. When you're asking me that, do you mean what am I working on in terms of presentations? Is that part of what you're thinking?
No, I was thinking in your teaching.
Oh, well, in my teaching, what I've been working on is I've really been working on how to get people like my students to actually be able to ask good questions. I find that they don't really ask good, powerful questions, and I'm not sure how can I get them to ask better questions.
So what you're working on then is getting them to be more curious and to be more aware of the questions that they're asking. So you're trying to teach them to become better questioners.
Yes, I mean, I've been told many times that the inquiry approach is one of the best ways to teach science. And since I've been teaching science, I'm finding that inquiry is really important. But I find that the students are more interested in what I would call cookbook science, meaning they do the science following the recipe and they don't really generate any curiosity. So you're right, it's curiosity.
So Bena, what would you hear your students doing or saying if they are generating curiosity?
I think what I would hear them saying is, I think I would hear them puzzling and wondering rather than coming up with very factual, these are the three things, or what do we think, what would be the best fact, or where can we get the best resources? In other words, what I would like them to do is hold back from trying to get information, do research, and answer questions, and actually generate things that puzzle them. I wonder why this happens in this way. I wonder what this really means. I wonder if we did it this way instead of that way. So I suppose I'd like them to be wondering and curious and questioning.
So Bena, as you anticipate lessons in the future, what might you do to stimulate students to be more generative in their questions as well?
Well, I've learned a couple of things using technology that have really been helpful. And I'm beginning to think that maybe I could do something like, well, I don't know, I think like something that would behave more like a bulletin board. So maybe something like Padlet or something like a Jamboard, something that where I have the kids get into small groups and I have them just generate a whole lot of questions and have them really hold back from trying to figure out which is the best question, which one we're going to use, but to actually just be very generative and allow them to do that. And then I guess I wonder what I would do next would be, I think I would help them to classify or categorize the questions so that we find them and make them more manageable. But I think just the generative process would be very helpful.
So you're really wanting your students to be curious, to be questioners, to be problem solvers, and you're thinking about some lessons in the future in which you will engage that curiosity. And you have some ways of inspiring students to use that curiosity and to become even more curious by asking powerful questions.
That's right. I hope I'm going to be a good teacher because my big question will be, will it work? So I'll let you know.
We'll see.
So Art, let's be metacognitive about what we just modeled, just so that people can see the parts of it. So as you were thinking about the questions you were going to ask me, and by the way, it was probably a good thing that we didn't practice and rehearse this, because it actually had the spontaneity and truthfulness of the way it works, which is I was being asked to kind of construct an idea, and I didn't really have an idea other than to say I want kids to be better questioners. Now your questioning got me to shape an idea. So let's just say, how did you do that? What were some of the things going on in your mind?
Well, I tried to use questions with positive presuppositions that one, you had a goal in mind and that you were anticipating these questions. I tried to use plurals, so multiple goals. I tried to paraphrase what you were saying and to empathize with your desire to have children become more curious and more inquisitive in their own lives, and that you, as a teacher, were in control of that, and that you had planned lessons that were specific in helping students become more curious and more investigative, better inquirers.
So really you were using both listening and questioning, because you really listened carefully to my language, you reflected it back to me, and then you were moving it forward.
Yes, and sometimes I had to pursue a little bit to find out what it would sound like or look like, so that what you were seeing as behaviors that you wanted, that I understood those as you did as well. So we were on the same brainwave. We clarified each other's language, and you helped me understand what you were thinking of.
So thank you. That was a very powerful coaching. And now I think we are really trying to come to an end of this by helping people see that that modeling is very real. It's very possible. It's something that you really can do, and that you can do it as you are working with the students or working with the faculty, working with your colleagues, that it's all about beginning to think about this as the first step is, I want to really hear what you say. I felt when I was being questioned by Art, he was actually hearing what I was saying. He wasn't rerouting me. He wasn't giving me a lot of advice. He was actually telling me what I was saying, describing it to me. And then thinking that if you are valuing that, as we talked about that, and if you really see the benefit in that, then your questions can also interact with that fine listening by bringing out more powerful thinking through the questions that you ask. So based on your learnings in this presentation, let's give you a moment to just think about this. What will you stop doing? What will you continue doing? And what will you start doing?
Thank you for joining us in this presentation. We particularly appreciate your participation because you are obviously continuous learners, and that's what we are all about.
And we really appreciate the fact that we were able to be with you virtually. We wish we could have been present with you, but virtually, I hope it worked for you as it did for us. And we look forward to hearing all the wonderful things that you are doing. So don't hesitate to be in touch with us. You have all of the information in our handouts. And in addition, go to our website. And thank you so much. We enjoyed the session with you.